Welcome back to another edition of Research Fantasy Presents our PGA DFS picks for the Dell Technologies Championship held at TPC Boston. A par 71, 7,342-yard course. Gets a little bit redone every year from what I've read. I think this year they are shortening a par 4. It's still a par 4, but they're making it a little bit shorter. Like last week, one big stat that I looked at was par 4, 400 to 450s. I think that actually ended up being a pretty solid predictor of what happened for the most part. This week, it's looking like things like par 3 scoring, tee to green, strokes gained putting are all things that we want to look at. It's important to note that just because somebody is ranked first coming in this week over 24 rounds in, let's say, par 3 scoring, in order for that statistic to have relevance, they need to be number one or, very good in that metric this week as well. So it takes past behavior to try to predict future behavior, but it's important to remember it's not a perfect science. I think the relationship I'm finding with golf, even within that 24 round data, because it's enough, I feel like, that you've got some recency in it, but you're not like way too heavily weighting it. So I like to try to balance it just by the eye game. If a guy looks like he's been lucky, maybe I'll shy away, because luck in this sense is something that I don't think is predictable. If it's someone who's genuinely just hitting good shots, and I think there's a couple golfers on here specifically that fall into that category. I think, that's what you want to look at. Last week, we predicted a Jordan Spieth win. Unfortunately, we fell just short. Dustin Johnson, I believe, was either our 7th. I think he was our 7th ranked golfer. We ended up with 5 of our top 10 finishing in the top 10, with Spieth finishing 2nd, Casey 5th, Kuchar 10th, and Kevin Chappell tied 6th. We did have 2 missed cuts in the top 10 with Hideki Matsuyama and Francesco Molinari. Those were a little bit heartbreaking and deflating, especially Matsuyama, who was someone that I did think was going to carry the ownership, and he did, and it really was spread out amongst the higher dollar plays. I think you'll see that still this week, though. I do think you'll see some constriction in that just because of the fact that there's less of a field yet again this week. With that, let's start it off with a guy who I do think is going to win this week, and that's Rickie Fowler, 17-4 fantasy draft, 9K FanDuel, 9,700 Draftkings. Hey, Rickie Fowler won here in 2015, playing tremendous golf right now. He's been great over the past few months, and it's certainly easy to say that if you watch the PGA Championship and if you watched last week at the Northern Trust, his putter is truly what's leading the way. So if he can keep that rolling, I think that this is a course that he should be able to have great success with. He comes in ranked number 3 in our rankings this week, and he's someone I'm going to be building a lot of my teams around, under 10K. So he's got, quite a few people, I think, ahead of him, at least 5 guys ahead of him. Price sits perfectly with me this week. Let's move on to Louis Oosthuizen, 15-9 fantasy draft, 8,100 FanDuel, 9,100 Draftkings. When I referred to the guy earlier that was just making all the shots and just looked good, Fowler was one of those guys. Louis O is another one. He scares me, though, because it's his putter that's been leading, and we know that sometimes his putter can just slip away from him. But pretty solid course history here, which is something that I'm really, really, really interested in. Something that I want to have in my lineups. I think that he is somebody that you could put with Rickie and still build a solid enough lineup around. And that's going to be my strategy this week, at least in some of my cash games. I think those 2 guys should be able to put together pretty solid weekends. Adam Scott, 15-9 fantasy draft, 8,600 FanDuel, 7,900 on DraftKings. That's a pretty low price for Scott. Solid but unspectacular, which is why I think you do see that price drop a little bit on DraftKings. I don't feel great about it. He has a solid history here. Again, we'll say that's solid yet unspectacular. Play has been, I bet you, I haven't looked, but I would bet that his last 12 rounds probably look better than his last 24 rounds of golf. Second in par 3 scoring, which I think there's 4 par 4s here, and that was a lead indicator. That was actually the top indicator on average over the last 3 years. The winner was like between 1 and 5, so that's par 3 scoring. I think is going to be a big deal if he continues kind of his resurgence. I think he'll be a great play. Let's look for this week's Tony Finau, and that's going to be Patrick Cantlay, 14-4 on Fantasy Draft, 6,600 FanDuel, 7,200 Draftkings. If you don't understand what I'm saying with this week's Tony Finau, it's a guy who fits this course well enough, but the price on him is far too low, and considering a pretty solid finish last week, I think you're going to see the ownership shift from Finau to Cantlay. I think Finau is actually 7,100 this week, but it's not. This course doesn't necessarily fit Finau's style as much as I think it does Cantlay. Cantlay sitting at 12th in bogey avoidance, 19th tee to green. I think he's a guy that you could feel pretty decent about putting in your cash games, but just like with Finau last week, he makes an almost immediate avoid in tournaments, or at least an underweight in tournaments, because if he sees that 28 to 33% ownership range, if you're overweight on him to try to get a jump on the field, and what happens to Finau last week happens, and you're at 40%, you've got 40% dead lineups. You can't afford that this week. The last thing I will say on this week is it's definitely a week, more than anything else, you absolutely need to cross 6 of 6 unless something absolutely ridiculous happens and you're left in a situation where, you know, half of the highest owned plays, at least, maybe even 80% of the top 10% owned plays don't make it and create a little bit of a lopsided effect. You're dealing with like 100 golfers or something like that. If 70 are making the cut, just not really too much to... No room for error is what I'm getting at. So you got to be really sharp with what you do. And this could be a week where even crossing 6 of 6 isn't going to just be an automatic check mark. You may have to have, you know, all your guys in the top 30. So just pay attention. Obviously, you're going to have to take some risks to try to differentiate your lineup. Good luck to you. I hope everyone can win some money. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel below. Check us out at researchfantasy.com. Follow us on Twitter at researchandwin, and join us again next week.